despite all sorts of obstacles that are thrown. And I'm under a gag order, I can't defend myself, but you didn't make me feel as though you required that of me. So thank you so much. Thank you for your leadership and your kindness and the work we're doing, which is what we're supposed to be doing, or I thought I was supposed to be doing. But maybe what's going on is a different kind of call, and you're teaching me that. Thank you. You can treat me like a TV and interrupt, hit the pause button, get some food, though that's a problem around here sometimes. And let me just say that I'm considering whether I can today explore a certain kind of logic of injury with you. I wanted to work on Pasolini with you. Because, in part, he was so anxious about the sudden moralizing fervor of the left that turned on him. Of course, he was a little provocative, I'll grant that. And he also got into almost a Heideggerian, the magnitude of strife with his beloved students, and found himself always on the wrong side of everyone, the right, the left, and he was pummeled, and in many ways he problematized something with regard to 1968, and the last question that still resonates was yours, Chris. You asked me about 1968 in August, and I was like, I blanked, like 1968, what's that? So I want to respond to that question according to another logic and temporality, and also to maybe think about how we can redirect revolutionary, some sort of will to fiction, will to power, some of the topics we've been working on. How can we, in days of greatest distress and catastrophe, politically, ethically, how can we do the work that we're assigned to do, and how can we assign ourselves to others who are desperately destitute? And can we engage an increasingly abandoning world? Can we have a freer relation to our unfreedoms? When Heidegger chafes against the fact and facticity of our being under the sway and dominion of technology, he doesn't imagine, okay, I know he's a scoundrel and we've devoted thousands of pages to knocking about with Heidegger, but he's still unbypassable in so many ways, though I don't blame those who part ways with the man Heidegger. But he asks very pertinently, I think, not how can we emancipate or free ourselves up from technology and its pernicious implications and effects, but how can we have a freer relation to technology? And so I'm asking, taking up the call and the relay, how can we have a freer relation to our unfreedoms? Then I thought, I just want to sit with you, warriors of philosophy and thought. But I rouse from my silence and retreat, and I want to consider some of the consider some of the kind of indefensible texts that come from a certain kind of U.S. American faltering in terms of revolutionary desire and behaviors, and I thought I would think with you about Valerie Solanas. Are you up for that? I have 5,000 different, yes, I have different possibilities here. As a true obsessional neurotic, I prepared 5 lectures, and you can switch it up, or I could DJ and scratch and pop, but that's not a good idea. We want to, even though I urged you to remember Bataille, stop making sense, I think we all crave some sense making, if that's possible. And what happened in 1968? Your question that I put on hold, and that was kind of holding me together with crazy glue and also holding me hostage. What happened in 1968 also that failed, and that how did we get here where we are in the disaster of political, what Lacoue-Labarthe and Nancy have called in our panique politique, we're in political panic. Freud was already worried about where we were going, down the drain. And he said that the movement from narcissism to identification with the other, a necessary shift in disposition and thought, may not happen anymore. And I think he had a terribly solemn and important point to score with that. Can you get out of your narcissistic holding cells and identify with the other? Freud was pessimistic that that was going to be possible ever again. People are in lockdown with themselves, interned by narcissistic vocabularies of self-interest and self-investments and so on. And that shift from narcissism to identification with the other, so a breaking out of one's narcissistic constrictions and carceral being, is possibly no longer to be hoped for. This was Freud's worry, that people were just, and I know there's no examples in the world for this having happened. There's no narcissists in our leaderships, and we don't have to worry about it. And once again, Freud was wrong. But wow. So that's one of our tasks, to think not only, because some narcissism has got to be good. I need to re-narcissize, for example. But these are some of the issues that will confront us, and we wonder to what extent are we inheritors of some of the failures or false starts or bullshit of 1968, where the students did their fabulous uprisings and then recoiled in some ways. And what is the campus, the university, that very often functions as an autoimmune lab and destroys itself rather than supports and redirects necessary rebellion and revolt. Revolt is such a good word, because when you're revolted, it means you're not only turned inside out, like your stomach is turning, you're disgusted. But that kind of Nietzschean affirmation of disgust, of course he's out to kick some ass in terms of Kant. Kant is all about, and I'm reducing it obviously, the judgment of taste. And Nietzsche wants us to think. Nietzsche, the great emetic philosopher, meaning he, as we were discussing in class, he liked to throw up. And throwing up, as Deleuze points out, for Nietzsche is a kind of reversal of dialectics. It's also an anti-Hegelian purge. So, thinking of the Romans, who once and still haunt us here, maybe we should start constructing a vomitorium to honor our present day politics and leadership and let me just start. 1968. Jacques Derrida brought out his path-breaking essay, The Ends of Man. 1968. In June of that year, Valerie Solanas guns down Andy Warhol as he's speaking on the telephone. These events may seem miles apart on the cultural shock charts, yet they are linked in ways that urge us to reflect on their ineluctable contiguities. 1968. Both Derrida and Solanas are interested in the aims and finality of the concept man. By the way, I come with footnotes, subtitles, supertitles. Just ask if something, I actually want you to understand what I'm trying to say here. Even though I'm all for Unverständlichkeit in Schlegel's sense and unintelligibility, I want you to have a sense of some of these deliveries. So, admittedly, the concept of man and the way they cope and manage with man, and I'm in the Nietzschean sense, the last man, from what I understand, the last one to speak in this wonderful session. I applaud you for your stamina and your presence of mind. I was going to, one of my 5 lectures was on fatigue and the exhaustion of metaphysics and how tired and sick and tired. But I thought, oh my God, they're probably fatigued. And that will be, if they're hysterically suggestible as I am, they're going to hit the snooze button very quickly. So that was out. So the concept of man is what both Solanas and Derrida are going after and troubled by. Admittedly, that may be where their improbable rendezvous ends, somewhere on an existential corner of 1968, situated among the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Hampton, and Bobby Kennedy. This was the moment, in any case, when man, getting a political pounding, was up against the philosophical wall and steadily losing ground. Derrida, conceptually fitted for the job, was concerned with the excess of man, which Solanas, we could say, enacted, where he exposed the Greek ideal of anthropos. She went for the jugular of referential man, busting through layers of philosophical history to put out her own ends of man, her own limit case of the classical unity of man. Barely representable or representative, she was a speck. Now, did you understand what I just said about the classical unity of man? That for Derrida, there's something very problematic that we're still hanging on to some of the residue and pride that was invested by metaphysics and philosophy. And last night we heard Tom Keenan say, don't worry, we're not regressing to, well, my paraphrase, the metaphysics of humanity or the figure of man. There's something about the classical unity of man. Today in class, we discussed how Hannah Arendt, when she gives us the thought of what is world binding of world and how to create world in each encounter, almost as an ethical duty, to insist on what is weltbildend, so building up world within your encounter with the other, giving them world. She never puts in question world or mundus. She's not at the place of, let's say, Celan's unwo or non-world, the impossible impossibility of the world worlding henceforth. She doesn't see the world as shattered, but she hangs on to the world. So analogies are scandalous, but in a kind of parallel way, who is still hanging on to man as a philosophical concept? Are you kidding me? But let's make this work for you. Barely representable or representative, Solanas was a speck and specter on the margins of extremist writing. Her texts were loaded with irony and pointed at the real. Confined to the precincts of parasitical utterance, she adopted the language of a pest, plugging the kind of speech that counters while resembling hate speech. Strangely, she was meant to ride the dark side of a foreclosive wave, opening up a field of startling intensities by saying the unspeakable and then vanishing into the night of 1968. She was on the verge of instituting her sexual hermeneutics, at least in terms of language games. When launching a verbal assault, she struck where no terror had been located, or the terror against which she set up her linguistic shop had not been heeded or addressed, not even recognized. I quote Valerie Solanas here. Most philosophers, not quite so cowardly as most men, face the fact that male lacks exist in men, but still can't face the fact that they exist in men only. So they label the male condition the human condition. They pose their nothingness problem, which horrifies them as a philosophical dilemma. So, sometimes you have to scream to be heard. This is what Heidegger says regarding Nietzsche in Was heißt denken, what is called thinking. Nietzsche, the shyest and most quiet of men, had to scream to be heard, and instituted the famous, Derrida picks this up and others do as well, Schreiben, Schrei. So the inscribing cry, the grito escrito, the cri écrit, which Heidegger says is Nietzsche's way of inscribing, is a scream precisely because he was the shyest of all. And in lecture 5 of Was heißt denken, what is called thinking, Heidegger has Nietzsche screaming. And the translation of this text also came out in 1968, so I want to put that in English as part of the eventfulness of 68. So he has, Heidegger, by the way, I went to, this won't surprise you, I went to a big Heidegger conference many moons ago, and all the heavies said, what do you mean there's a woman in Heidegger? Well, what mother in Heidegger? And it was so foreclosed or disavowed what I was trying to work with, which is Heidegger's, the woman in Heidegger and the woman in Nietzsche. So in 68, in the translation at least, Nietzsche is figured as a woman, and Nietzsche figures herself as a woman. Is always pregnant with the future, is always expecting. It has incorporated Eve as the scientist in whom Nietzsche is invested, because Eve was the sassy, feisty, scientific being that was not afraid of the man, that absolutely went to the encounter with prohibition, and she's still getting pummeled to this day and saddled with labor pains. But Nietzsche identified with Eve. Certainly when writing and thinking about the scientificity of science, she's the first scientist for him who goes beyond good and evil. She didn't worry about, she had this will to knowledge that got her, as you know, eternally punished. But for Nietzsche, when he wrote The Gay Science, Die fröhliche Wissenschaft, Eve was the incorporated scientific force that he reverts to. So there is this woman in Nietzsche. There are many women in Nietzsche. There's also not so great women in Nietzsche, because he's also railing against certain kinds of women that he doesn't restrict to anatomical considerations. Certain men can be, as Arnie Schwarzenegger might say, girly boys, you know, and that's not the kind of warrior woman is what Nietzsche is always and again assimilating to himself. You might also think of Lou Salome, whom he says inseminated his ear with the thought of the eternal return. So she was the father of his thought and has the patent and the paternity suit in her favor that Nietzsche then carried to term. The invaginated ear is something, and the labyrinth, you know, Nietzsche was very proud of his little beautiful ears. I don't know how he got to see them, but that's another issue. Seriously, but he said they were labyrinths, and so they inscribed all of Greek mythology as well. But she inseminated his ear with the thought of the eternal return. So in Was heißt denken, when Heidegger is kind of pulling Nietzsche into and out of rehab and trying to clean up his act, since Nietzsche was egregiously appropriated by the Nazis. Heidegger, I don't know if he's the right man for the job, but he was on the job trying to clean up Nietzsche's act and misappropriations. He suddenly figures Nietzsche as a woman, even momentarily as a scolding mother. And if you look at Lecture 5, which is in the middle, you'll see that that Nietzsche, the passage to transgendered Nietzsche is very sudden in Heidegger. It occurs without transition or argument. So open a credit account, trust me, let me hope that I have you can give me the credit. It's scandalous not to be reading these passages with you. But if you look it up, you'll see that Nietzsche is a mother, and that Nietzsche is a this, and Nietzsche is a screaming woman. And it's almost an unconscious slide and fluidity of gender kinds of disruptions. Miss Nietzsche is suddenly screaming in Heidegger. We do not have to get into the particulars of his philosophical sex change at this point, but only to retain the feminization that occurs even to Friedrich Nietzsche, when a thinker must scream to get her point across. So, if you are pegged as a woman, your scream might be noted as part of an ensemble of subaltern feints. The complaint, the nagging, the moaning and bitching, the picking, the chatter, the nonsense by which women's speech has been largely depreciated. I know you don't know what I'm talking about, or historically tagged. Other quasi-linguistic worlds open up in this space, springing from the non-canonized tropes of aforementioned moaning and bitching. So few would want to scan the realm of garbled language games that are ascribed to so-called women. So scouring the unconscious of the social milieu through which she ventured, Valerie Solanas found herself disabled by the very fact of language, by its phallogocentric and political usages, by its disturbing record in the human sciences and liberal arts, by the mere fact of its incessant institutional collaborations. She was stuck in what Derrida would call a paleonymic rut. Like, not only did she have to use a language that she inherited and that was inherently tilted against her and masculinized in so many ways. But I don't know where that logic was going. Not only paleonymic, but language itself to her was out to get her because of its almost Lacanian qualities of the nom du père. I'm going to just leave that as a sidebar that we can discuss never or imminently or just let it ruminate. Maybe Valerie exploited the failed performative for all it's worth, knowing all along that failure was a matter only of degree. In some ways, Solanas shows up as a victim of the failed performative, as one who felt her verbal velocities could reach no one in a way that would truly mark or unhinge the brutal protocols of lived reality. At the same time, Valerie Solanas, who took no prisoners, took pleasure in the injurious effects of language and with Lacanian precision understood that words are bodies that can be hurled at the other, they can land in the psyche or explode in the soma. A hurtful utterance can give you hives, make you want to throw up, put a dent in your appetite, or summon up any number of somatic responses and physical collapses. It can also resignify the world or what's left of it. Solanas, she took her petition, her social contract, to the streets, something Rousseau had done when he was cooking up his revolution. Like all social contracts, it had an antisocial edge. So if we would think about a social contract and how antisocial they might be, or any manifesto, they're usually deeply misogynist. Just take a look at the Futurist Manifesto, where it said, among other things, let me quote for you, "We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for woman. We will destroy feminism." Every manifesto that I've looked at has at least a little pocket of that kind of add-on or surplus, or even foundational urge or libidinal surge to destroy and scorn woman. So if we had time and we could open up a dossier of why a manifesto manifests such hatred of women, or what's the threat here in the most militaristic armament of declaring freedom, why is this kind of particularized hatred summoned up? So the Solanas tract, which is also a manifesto, was payback. It was clocked to strike the time of response to all shameless woman-hating manifestos and their counterparts, the universalizers. No matter how you cut it, universal, whether common or communist, means man. Solanas was intent on ending it and tightening the noose around the finitude of man. So we want to understand what the Scum Manifesto is trying to achieve and how it's weaponizing language and history in a certain way. As concerns her relation to the ends of man, so Derrida's text, we could say that Derrida cautions against the unabating adherence to the figure of man in contemporary philosophy, hinting at the calamity of translating Dasein, as we discussed in class, into man, centering everything on anthropological man, something that even existentialists such as Sartre, among others, was responsible for upholding. So there's a slippage and a regression even among those who are kind of trained by existentialism and Heidegger to lose the man. They keep on reverting to the obsolete concept of man. Valerie was fuming. From her locked ward at Bellevue Hospital that summer of 1968, Solanas takes a pot shot at Sartre, comparing herself to Jean Genet, whom she believes herself to top in terms at least of writerly social commitments. She exclaims, "Genet just reports, despite what Sartre and de Beauvoir, two overrated windbags, say about the existential implications of this work. I, on the other hand, am a social propagandist." So there was a French track running in her head. Okay, this is a very explosive, out of control, rogue American revolutionary who's trained on and fed by French texts. Solanas herself, through all sorts of detours and grammatical aberrations, was bent on showing, through her writings and actions, that the presumed unity of man was a dangerous fiction. One cannot deny the pernicious soundtrack that Solanas lays down in her text, or every interpretable level. There are, on every level, there are indexes of rage, murderous intention, finality, and telic purpose. She's aiming at man. There was androphobic noise at every turn. I try to read why she had to shoot at the name of Andy, who's already an anthropos to the max on steroids, Andy Warhol. At the same time, there is evidence of other soundtracks that run interference with the dominant tones and semantic registers of the text's purported meaning. There are orchestrated slippages, unstoppable flip sides, countermanding orders, measured contradictions, internal freakouts, and logical insurrection. Valerie steers clear of replicating masculinist topoi and the simple call to arms with which we might associate other historically outraged petitions. Instead, she introduces static and interference to bear on every possible referential stronghold, without, however, loosening her grip on the troubled signifiers she has in her sights: man, father, state, money, models, melt, offering no solid grounding. So she's really aiming against all sorts of tropologies that hold together familialisms and that actually, to this day, try to tag the leader as a father figure and all of these derived problems of authority that we could consider in another context. Revolution is itself tainted by the insufficiency of the signifier, the corruption of male-marked colonizations of language. I quote her, "No genuine social revolution can be accomplished by the male. The male so-called rebel is a farce," she writes. I'm going to skip. So despite communitarian insinuations, Valerie Solanas was a loner. There is something poignantly American, North American, about the way she handled the self-acknowledged loser life with which she was saddled. One thinks of the petitions and plaints of the solitary ranters for whom missives and missiles collapse into an indissociable, deadly mission. Lacking the elegance or cultural legitimacy of a subcomandante Marcos, a weatherman, the 68 crew, or a proponent of the civil rights movement, the so-called Unabomber, David Koresh and Solanas, are more vagabond. So one could think of a typology of North American and South American revolutionary figures. The US comes up very often with more vagabond revolutionaries or killers or shooters or snipers, more vagabond, unmoored, and alone with their inscriptions, offering a spare cluster of more deinstitutionalized and depopulated sense of what revolutionary might mean or intend. In the case of Valerie Solanas, her fringe existence was part of the package deal of untimely impacts, aspects of which derive from Stonewall, which was 1969, the beginning of gay liberation, and other American inventions of resistance on and off campus. Valerie was not meant to have disciples or spawn a new breed of revolutionaries. She offered the uniquely American dead-end one-warrior revolution spinning on its own determined axis. She had no followers until now. She arrives too late or too early on every scene. Who needed a runaway hothead, paisan, the comic strip lesbian avenger, in the summer of '68? Boy, did she show up at the wrong time. Now she would be a shiro, except for the indefensible shooting of Andy Warhol. So she shows up, and who needs this lesbian avenger in 1968? Who cared about her target practice and rage against great art? So she was raging against great art and its over investment and exaltation. Who cared about that when King and Bobby and Malcolm X were being slaughtered, when France was surging and Germany blowing up? Or for that matter, when women, for the first time, were protesting the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. Narrowing the focus considerably, who in the factory, so Warhol's hangout, needed a script writer and editor when Andy Warhol was improvising and producing no edit, uncut, no budget filmage. Moreover, Valerie, a creature of the theater, was seeing her dramatic investments obsolesced by the technologies under Warhol's control. She was never on time or on target, yet something keeps seeking points of contact and keeps coming through. I mean, why are we even talking about her? Her then kind of boyfriend, Mark Motherfucker, member of Up Against the Wall Motherfucker, staged street theater, a happening on her behalf, trying to rally some troops. But to return to the poor timing that appeared to define her, when Valerie Solanas was sentenced in the summer of 1969 to 3 years in jail, the news was reported deep in the remote pages of the New York Times in an article that appeared adjacent to a notice addressed to city residents concerning a change in the summer garbage collection. The world was headlining other news. This may seem a sorry and sad fate for the woman declared by Norman Mailer to be the Robespierre of feminism. It was no less a disappointment for Mr. Warhol, who saw his near extinction miniaturized by world events. Seeing themselves thus reduced and compressed, both Andy and Valerie were in the dumps that summer after '68. Still, the garbage pile is where we wanted to land. It is the place from which, and you said I'm always making a mess, so here I am. In the garbage pile, it's the place from which Solanas was signaling, culturally rummaging, the impossible place of an irremissible littérature or literature, as we might hear it as well. After all, one meaning of scum throws us into garbage, and we do not want to lose a sense of the excremental site to which Solanas relentlessly points and from which she speaks. Wounded and wounding, she has come out shooting, unsnapping all manner of discursive safety nets and cultural supports that have allowed violence to be absorbed. She has removed the patriarchal shock absorbers. So, in 1968, Solanas has taken away the soporifics that push women into poses of an accepting stupor, she claims. Before one becomes overly confident about arresting her outrageous development in terms of psychotic aberration, so what is a psychotic woman, inscribed and reinscribed? It is important to note that psychosis speaks, that it often catches fire from a spark in the real. It is fueled and fanned and remains unsettling because as wounded utterance, it is not merely or solely demented. I am not persuaded that we have before us only a psychotic text that we can dismiss and toss out, but it does rise out of the steady psychoticization of women, a threat under which most of us live, and against whose coarse endurance we contribute enormous amounts of energy. We don't even realize how much energy you put out when you're psychoticized as a woman. Unless one is able to perform the Freudian Spaltung, the split, the protective self-splitting, many of us minoritized, evicted creatures spend ourselves staving off the pressures of social psychoticization and different modes of social death. Listen, some types of accepted derangement are hard won. We have fought for every inch of clinical corroboration and for the symptomal housing projects that shelter our anguish. Certain diseases become a woman, strengthening her stature in unexplored domains of suffering. They encourage her daredevil collapses, linguistic feints. Valerie, however, poor Valerie, refuses the prestige and license of hysteria. Why couldn't she just be a hysteric? She refuses that prestige or that of any of the neighboring neurotic dialects that might be understood in feminist precincts. She is no Dora, no Anna O, no Marquise von O. She bears none of the finely crafted, delicate, brilliant flush of symptoms with which, thanks to the work of outstanding feminist theorists, a new form of dissidence and social disruption could be tried. Our Valerie, by contrast, was a psycho. Butch, dykey, angry, poor, and fucked up. Who could ask for more? Well, 1968 was certainly not the best moment for Valerie Solanas to make her appearance. There is no doubt that she felt forlorn around the factory girls, painfully pitting her butch androgyny against the hyper-femininity that Warhol favored. Warhol really persecuted her. She was one lonely lady in the heady glamour days of Candy Darling and Viva, way before the Guerrilla Girls, Lesbian Avengers, Queer Nation et al., and routine outings got going, so way before. So, Valerie Solanas, her text speaks even though it mimes at times delusional frenzy, or rather it goes to the place where delusion and the real catastrophically meet, where no amount of reality testing could bring it down to safer ground. There is nothing comforting here except for the fact that she became the transmitter for the unspeakable, calling for an end that was in fact already prescribed and inherent to the concept of man. In some ways, though, without the training and restraint, she showed the tendencies of a girl Nietzsche. He too had his typewriter, the first philosopher to use the hammers. He was known for philosophizing with a hammer, although in the sense perhaps neither of a typewriter nor of a piano, however much these instruments of his thoughts were always at hand. He was the first to have girl students, Nietzsche. This is as Friedrich Nietzsche, who was Friedrich Kittler, who is also a professor at EGS, said this is a total world shift, a game-changing shift, that Nietzsche had girl students and invited women to study with him. Kant started that, and then it stopped, and then Nietzsche. So he was the first to have girl students, and as I said, he called Lou Salome the father of his thought. She is credited with having inseminated his invaginated ear with the thought of the eternal return. Nietzsche, on several occasions and in many ways, was no longer and not anymore a mere man. Recycling the words a critic once wrote, he proclaimed, "I'm not a man, I'm dynamite." Not only the gunpowder traces Solanas to Nietzsche, nor only the startling intensities of their attacks or the way they shoved God's corpse on their backs, their criticism of higher education, or their strained solitude and fragile bodies that make of these gatecrashers fugitive companions. Solanas, even though she goes for the jugular of an entity she calls man, has already let him slip by to the extent that man is a becoming, mutated, and fading entity. She does not go in the direction specifically of the Nietzschean transhuman, the Übermensch, though Nietzsche himself or herself leaves room for Solanas's mutations to the extent that Übermensch is not an Übermann, and it was scandalously translated as a superman or an overman. It's not, it's an Übermensch. So it leaves, rather, the field of becoming wide open to feminine implant. What Nietzsche calls the philosophers of the future might be injected with a female hormone here or there. Nietzsche, like all of us, is overman. Thank you.